Okay, now apprenticeships. So let me just tell you a bit about this skilled trades study, because I think it's kind of interesting and maybe provides some context here. So the ministry in the summer directed all the workforce planning boards and local employment planning councils to undertake a study on the in-demand skilled trades. And they were actually very directive in terms of how they wanted this done. First of all, it was mainly they wanted everyone to just speak to employers. We don't want you to talk to anybody else. We want you to get the information from employers. And here are the questions we want you to ask and have answered. And then they were also very prescriptive about how we were to report this information, which is, all kinds of online, forums and so on and so forth. So most boards, and as did Simcoe Muskoka, would have done some data analysis, undertook interviews with employers, did an employer survey, did focus groups, and it took quite some time. Now, I had the pleasure of doing this study for 4 boards, and so I got to see results from a whole bunch of different areas. So Simcoe Muskoka was one, Peel Halton was another, York Region was another, Nipissing Parry Sound was another, and I also did the survey analysis for the Sudbury board. And it's as if the employers got a cheat sheet, and they were told, or they all got schooled in what they should say. Like, it is really remarkable. There were maybe 20 points that anyone could make if you took everyone's responses and summarized it. And we're talking like hundreds of surveys, interviews, focus groups. There's around 20 points, and I'll tell you what some of those were in a second. And each board, you could count on at least 15 of those 20 points being mentioned, cumulatively. All of which is to say, this has been a problem. The complaints they have been kind of regurgitated like for 15 years or so. Like, we seem to be running across the same problem all the time. So essentially they're saying, we can't get youth to go into the trades. And why is this happening? Well, and a lot of it has to do with, what are the youth being attracted by? Well, they gotta want to work in an office. They want to work with computers. They don't want to work with their hands. Our high schools aren't introducing them to the trades in the way they used to before. We don't have shop programs as much. We don't have tech programs. So they don't know about it. Or if they know about the trades, they only know about a handful of trades, like plumber, electrician, and that's about it. It's consistent. Urban, rural, small town, big town, all these employers are saying this is a real serious problem. And it's made worse by the fact that you have an age profile of people in the skilled trades who are now starting to reach retirement in larger numbers. And there are a number of trades, we can show you the data, where in fact 50% of the people who are journey persons are 50 or 55 years and older. And that's like truck and coach technician, and some of these more sort of millwrights in manufacturing. And that's scary, okay? Because of these large numbers of retirements. But what's worse is that even though the numbers who are registering for apprenticeships are slowly increasing, they can't fill those spots. And I think this is the big demographic gap we have now. Because the people who are retiring have got like 15, 20, 30 years experience, and they can't be replaced by apprentices or by people who've been journey persons for 2 or 3 years, because they, there's kind of like a learning curve quite beyond from what you learn, just on the job, but while working over a period of time. And moreover, with that large population group retiring, it also reduces the number of people who are there to be journey persons as trainees of these new apprentices. And then and then there's also, I guess, a spectrum of what kind of apprenticeships youth, if they do go into apprenticeships, what they'll do. And it's pretty clear that the dirtier it is and the more often you work outside, they don't want to do it. So there'll be auto service technicians, but they won't be auto body repairers. It's those kinds of distinctions. And the manufacturing sector is hurting because people assume that the manufacturing sector is declining and the jobs are kind of old. So basically, we're screwed. like I got to tell you, it is a real, it's a significant problem, and I can understand why the government is kind of trying to respond to it, because it's going to take a while to bring this all back. Yeah. Sorry.
So I know that out there in the workforce, there are a lot of people who are working in the skilled trades who haven't necessarily gone through the apprenticeship route and don't have a number. So I wonder what the numbers would look like for that group of people who are working as whatever, but didn't necessarily go through the apprenticeship route.
So a couple of things. So we have 144 trades, and 22 of them are compulsory trades. So there you absolutely have to have a certificate. Most of those are actually in the motive sector and construction sector: electricians, plumbers, auto service technicians. And there, some of the numbers aren't too bad, because those are also the ones that are better known oftentimes, and especially auto service technician. There's still a lot of programs, and the high schools do more of that, but it's in the manufacturing where there's probably the biggest gap. Then there are programs where we have apprenticeships, and I think there's really, so there's a lot of people who are working who are not it's a voluntary trade. You don't need a certificate, and a lot of people are working without a certificate. And some of those categories, you almost have to say, yeah, why not? Because like a cook is an apprenticeship, but the number of cooks we have who aren't tradespeople is it's a very small percentage, and you could go through them. So it's kind of a different answer depending on the trade. And there, but the funny thing is that we asked employers sometimes to identify the trade they're talking about, and we asked them, we thought, well, just for a lark, we'll say, so by the way, is this a compulsory trade or a voluntary trade? And a quarter of the time when it was a compulsory trade, the employer thought it was a voluntary trade. And that's kind of scary, because I would have thought they would know. And a voluntary trade, 40% of it got it wrong. 40% thought the voluntary trade they hire for is actually a compulsory trade. So we see, especially in manufacturing, you see two extremes. You see there's a cluster of employers who do apprenticeships all the time, and there's another cluster that don't. And they will tend to hire more of those people who don't have a certificate. And so some employers put more of a premium on it, but also in terms of those 20 points that I mentioned, so a big one is the extent of poaching that takes place, and a big complaint among those employers who do the apprenticeship training and then have the person, after a year or two after getting their certificate, get lured by another employer. Again, among those 20 points, one that you mentioned is a huge complaint about the complexity and paperwork of the apprenticeship system. And a major one being that once the College of Trades was created, Ontario College of Trades, there was a function where before the apprenticeship person from the ministry would come out to the workplace and sit down with the apprentice and with the employer and kind of go over what it's all about and say, and listen, if you have a problem, give me a call. So that function has apparently fallen off. It's not done either by the college or by the ministry office. And I can't tell you, like that might have been one of the top suggestions from employers. They say, can you bring this back? Because they say now, even if we call the ministry and it takes us 4 weeks to get a phone call return. All of which is to say, I think this is going to come up on your radar much more. And I think what you're going to see is that like a lot of the solutions are going to have to involve kind of getting in on the ground level with the Ontario Youth Apprenticeship programs in the high schools. And a lot of the employers wish there was some kind of clearinghouse so that when someone wants to do an apprenticeship, they can go to some online resource, and similarly those apprentices could find employers. And it may be that organizations like yours are going to have to be more on the lookout for playing that kind of intermediary role. So just I know we're almost short of time, but I was doing everything I can to stay away from the numbers. So just to show you the registration numbers, certainly it's at least at the board level and the region level, for the last 5 years, the number of new registration has slowly been creeping up, and it's gone up like actually 20% in 5 years. So that's good. I'm going to skip, the age, obviously, they're all going to be younger. 80% males. Really, the females, when you look at journey persons, most of the kind of traditional trades, there's never more than 5% women, whether it's auto service technician or plumber or electrician or what have you, 3 to 6 or 7% females at the most. The numbers are driven up because there's a child development practitioner apprenticeship, so that gets large numbers. And a few others like that in the service sector. Here are the top trades that are registered for. So there again, hairstylist, of course, is the other trade, a larger number of females. And the proportion of the proportion of hairstylists who are women has increased a lot over the last 5 or 10 years. Anyway, so the top 5 registrations, you could see, like if you go across the rows, they're the same everywhere. Electrician, number 1, auto service technician, number 2, hairstylist, number 3, plumber, and number 4, so then plumber and general carpenter, but those are the top 5 are the same everywhere. And those first 4, of course, are compulsory. So hairstylist is a compulsory trade. It's in an occupation that is hairstylists and barbers are not a trade. Hairstylist is a trade. So Canada Ontario Job Grant, you can see we've got like 195 Canada Ontario Job Grant contracts in Simcoe and Muskoka the last year, and almost all of them are in firms of under 160 employees. Well, that's interesting. That's a typo. It should be 150. Not to say there aren't any where you see zeros, but because it kind of rounds down, I think there were 1 or 2 that were in that category. But in any case, clearly, locally, many more smaller employers using this grant. The training providers, so here's another one where oddly enough, neither the school boards nor the colleges or the universities in Simcoe and Muskoka deliver a Canada Ontario Job Grant. And I find that kind of unusual. I don't understand why that would be the case. Here it's 73% are private trainers and then 19% private career colleges. The participants, again, slightly smaller uptake here compared to the rest of the province as a share of the client size. Oh, there's something else. Oh, I know. I don't have the slide, but I know that the other thing about this COJG participants is in terms of their educational attainment, tend to have higher levels of education. So again, you go back to what is this training for? It's often for kind of management type occupations, as opposed to, I just feel there's something about when you get the private trainers who are finding the clients through the employers, they're offering them a service that they want to sell as opposed to the employer necessarily needs, and it's certainly not being used for entry-level workers much at all, or for even career advancement. It's more for supervisors and management, from what I could tell from the numbers. And lastly, Youth Job Connect, again, small numbers, like 339 participants in Youth Job Connect last year, a smaller proportion than what the share of the Ontario number is smaller than the population share. All right. But I wasn't going to put up a slide that show you the age distribution because they're all youth. Okay, so that's it. I'm happy to ask any more questions. Yeah?
I just have a question about you. On several of the slides, you referenced the population group as Indigenous, Aboriginal, Native. In my work, I work for a First Nation in employment and training and also in education. And one of the things that the local school board has said is that the incidence of self-reporting identity is very suspect. There's often that population group is larger than what is represented on surveys or anything else, just because of some sort of other factors at play. And I'm just curious if you have taken that into account when or if the sources of how you or your work that you're doing is actually coming up with the number of that population group, based on some of the other bias that exists.
Yeah, I can only go on the basis of what kind of feedback I get.
Yeah.
So these are the numbers that we have. I certainly do feel that in the case where it is self-reported, that it's always going to be suspect. I feel better when it's closer to some other number that reflects what the population is. So, which may not be a smart way of doing it. So, for example, as I said, like the proportions for the Aboriginal population as a share of the employment services client group has been slowly increasing, and it's getting closer to what the share is of the unemployed.
Well, so to further that, then, in your mind, is that reflective of actually more people accessing the service or more people self-identifying as individuals?
Yeah, you're right. We can't know. It's only, I mean, the way we knew about the visible minority piece was because everyone in the room was saying, no, that's not the case, right? And so so if others know about, I certainly want to get kind of some anecdotal evidence on this, because I think it is important. And I'm not sure, I do think that for those designated groups, that they want to track it, then they should track it properly. And, in the way that, the census, kind of is a kind of requirement in terms of, reporting. I guess I wouldn't put too much into it.
I guess it's just a warning that you have to be careful with how, if we're grouping people by population and how they identify, just to be warned that sometimes those numbers don't reflect the populations or access to service.
That's definitely a good point. Yeah, okay, appreciate that. Any other questions? Okay, then great, thank you.